Thank you all for having me. So I'm very honored to be here today. I want to begin by stating that this talk is not designed to convince anyone that I've discovered the answer to the question. I'm merely going to provide some anecdotal and sort of contextual evidence that suggests a new take on the authorship of the sonnets. It's also not exhaustive. In fact, I think it would take me probably a course to go through all of the evidence, but I'm going to try to sort of race through everything. And I won't bore you with the whole story about how I became interested in the Shakespeare authorship question. I will just tell you a few facts. First, I grew up with Shakespeare. My father was an English professor at Ohio University, and he taught Shakespeare. He was a charismatic yet remote father. I was the middle of 5 children. We all craved more of him, me in particular. When I was languishing in the PhD portion of my joint degree, I read the Atlantic article arguing that the Earl of Oxford was the man behind the name Shakespeare. During one trip back to visit my parents, I brought up the article and asked my father what he thought about the issue in the hopes of connecting with him. He swatted the authorship question away with the classic, what does it matter if the works were written by a man named Shakespeare or by a man who called himself Shakespeare? As a woman and a budding psychiatrist, his answer completely silenced me, but did not satisfy me. I was appropriately squashed and did not return to the question until about 25 years later, when I lived in London for a year. There, I discovered Mark Rylance and his views on the authorship question. In one article that I've read about him, it mentions that he considers Mary Sidney as one of the possible viable candidates for the authorship. My father's words came back to me. Maybe it doesn't matter if we substitute one white male for another, but maybe it does matter if the author is a woman. So the next day, I asked my 3 daughters, 2 of whom have dyslexia, what they thought about the idea. Unanimously and without a pause, they said in unison, of course it would matter, Mom. So that motivated me. I read the book on Mary Sidney, written by Robin Williams, and was completely convinced. So I wanted to help promote Mary Sidney as a candidate. So I started investigating on my own, hoping to find sort of the smoking gun, or if not the definitive evidence, at least some additional data that could add to the argument. I turned to the sonnets, assuming, like many people, that the sonnets might contain the most biographical information about the author. They stumped me. Although I could imagine Mary as the voice behind the procreation sonnets, I could not envision her penning the other sonnets. The voice seemed male and elderly. So I took a few steps backward. Mary must not be the one. As a psychiatrist, I had learned one important lesson from my training. If I want to understand something, I try not to assume anything. I try to let go of all of my biases. If a young woman tells me her mother just died, even if she is crying, I cannot assume she is sad. She could be angry, feeling guilty, anxious, even relieved, or all of the above. I cannot assume. So I have taken this key idea and have tried to use a different method to examine the authorship question. I call it a theory of mind approach. So I decided to wipe the slate clean and start over. And I focused on the sonnets with the one basic assumption that the sonnets reveal something about the author. So theory of mind is just a form of cognitive empathy. It's the act of trying to understand the world from the perspective of another person. By observing their behavior, discovering their beliefs, motivations, fears, needs, wants, ambitions, values, anxieties, and defense mechanisms, we can try to construct an understanding of a person's mental state and even anticipate their reactions and behavior. This is not really a new concept, but it is a bottom-up strategy for answering the Shakespeare authorship question. We can find the author within the work through theory of mind. So it allows us to let the works predict the author. In order to do this, we need to suspend disbelief about almost everything we know and try to ignore all the assumptions about Shakespeare and the authorship question we might have. So just as an overview, The sonnets are divided into 3 groupings based on subject matter, the voice, and the language. The first 126 sonnets, called the Fair Youth Sonnets, are the voice of an older man expressing a range of emotions toward a younger man. The next 26 speak rather harshly of and to a dark lady. The last 2 sonnets in the sequence recount anecdotes that occur when Cupid happens to fall asleep. So today I'm only going to speak about the Fair Youth Sonnets. I have learned as a scientist that the cleaner your data, the better your results. Therefore, I chose to focus on the largest group of sonnets that seem to reflect a single voice. I tried to approach the sonnets with no preconceptions, but used this group. This group has a few major themes. The first 17 sonnets urge the fair youth to get married and have a child and are called the procreation sonnets. Others focus on the older man's pain of separation from the younger man. And many of the sonnets contain rather morbid ruminations about the passage of time, death, dying, and decay. So using the sonnets as data, we can construct what I would call a mental status report on the author. So as a psychiatrist performing an evaluation, I would begin by noting factual identifiers. Although they are not always obvious, you can glean some facts about the author from the sonnets. The number that I have in the slides within the parentheses indicates which sonnets contain the information I mention here. So I won't read you the passages, it would take too long, but you can go back through the sonnets to recognize these facts. In general, the sonnets can provide quite a bit of useful information, and we can start to get a fairly well-developed mental picture of the poet. So age and gender. The poet seems to be male, middle-aged to elderly. Physically, he's often tired and feels lame. Appearance, not much to mention on this subject other than chalked with tanned antiquity. Occupation, he mentions public duties, involvement with public policy, and seems to have worked for princes, not queens. After these identifiers, I would move on to the more internal aspects of the evaluation. This section includes recognizing, for instance, mood. I would note evidence of a depressed mood interspersed with some elements of mania or hypomania. He struggles with a sense of loss, moments of guilt, some hopelessness, fears, particularly of abandonment. His range of mood goes from feeling elevated, almost feverish love to despair. The physical manifestations of a depressed mood that I see in the sonnets include early morning awakening and heavy limbs. The physical manifestations of mania or hypomania include sleeplessness, irritability, and the sheer volume of written output. This questions sort of the thought process and the content. So he has intrusive thoughts. He has ruminations about death, dying, and the passage of time, some paranoia about the fair youth's infidelity, constancy, and jealousy over a rival. Speech and language. His language adopts rich metaphors. He is capable of abstract thinking, although his obsessionality makes his language somewhat repetitive. His self-esteem, he has bouts of painful insecurity, hints of masochism, and occasional grandiosity. So then you divide it into strengths and weaknesses. So what are his weaknesses? He's easily insulted, vulnerable to slights, and capable of jealous fits. Strengths, obvious intelligence and ability to express his feelings and perseverance. Motivations, clearly love for the fair youth, desire for reciprocated love, and an immortality wish. His personal stressors involve loss of several friends due to religious persecution, frequent travels, prolonged separations from loved ones, particularly the fair youth, social isolation, financial insecurities, and possible deterioration of physical health. Suicidal ideation, he has morbid obsessions with death, decay, and burial monuments. He can imagine the world without his presence, wonders if the fair youth would be better off after he dies, yet he does not articulate a clear suicidal wish, nor does he describe a plan. He has no evidence of homicidal ideation. So in summary, clearly the poet struggles with some signs of major depressive disorder with periodic episodes of hypomania. The morbid ruminations about death and decay, coupled with fears of abandonment, suggest a fragility often associated with prior violent trauma, but more history would be necessary to confirm such a diagnosis. The sexual history also shows some evidence of homosexuality. So what do we know about the fair youth? We cannot use theory of mind approach to the fair youth because we don't hear his voice. And we have to keep in mind that the author poet may have some biases about the fair youth, depending on his own emotional state at the time writing a particular sonnet. So he could, paint a contradictory portrait, but nonetheless, we have some facts that emerge from the sonnets that we can use to construct a picture. Age, he is younger than the author, but the sonnets cover several years, so he's youthful in some sequences and approaches more middle age in others. Physical description, fair, bright-eyed, beautiful, with many graces. He resembles his mother, perhaps even has an effeminate appearance. Character, true, wise, temperate, but resistant to commitment. Personality, gentle, kind, charismatic, attractive to and admired by others. Other emotional characteristics include independent, not easily controlled, elusive, enigmatic, and somewhat emotionally withdrawn. He has other identifiers, including he has had a portrait painted of himself. He is an infrequent and unreliable correspondent. He's of higher social standing than the poet. He's capable of self-delusion and perhaps even selfishness. He's been the object of slander. He may be a writer. He's subject of other poets' poetry and dedications, fond of praise, does not try as hard as he should, not as famous as he would like to be, and does not seem to live up to the poet's expectations. He's also older than the average bachelor in the procreation sonnets. So using this approach, I have come up with a new theory about who wrote the sonnets and the identity of the fair youth. Although the following sort of oversimplifies the journey that brought me to this possible insight. With the evidence that the poet experienced past trauma, we can look to the most famous incident that horrified the English in the 16th century. With this clue in mind, I think the mystery of the sonnets begins in the summer of 1572, 46 years before the first publication. Although this is an English mystery, the story, I think, begins in Paris, France, not London or Stratford. So in 1572, France had spent 12 years racked by a bloody civil war between the French Protestants and the Catholics. Finally, a reconciliation seemed possible. The peace was to be celebrated by the marriage between a Protestant prince, Henry of Navarre, and the king's Catholic sister, Princess Margaret. All of the main Protestant leaders were invited to Paris for the wedding. Visitors were instructed to relinquish their arms at the city gates, a policy they were told was adopted to keep the peace during the festivities. The couple was married on August 18th, 1572. The characters relevant to the story of the sonnets, in my mind, were in Paris at the time and attended the wedding. 5 days after the wedding ceremony, on the night of August 23rd, 1572, an eerie clanging of bells rang through the streets of Paris. Many of the Protestants, unarmed, were asleep in the Louvre Palace. The bells were a signal. The race to kill was on. Mobs descended into the streets. Someone had planned well. The Catholics had erected chain barriers to prohibit escapees from fleeing Paris. Armed guards restricted movement and manned the gates. All of the boats that would normally be used as escape routes across the Seine had been tied up on the far bank out of reach. The city had become a death trap. The business of hunting down human prey did not transpire in silence. Clubbing, stabbing, stoning men, women, and children to death did not happen quietly. The killing spree escalated out of control. Over the next 3 days, the mob killed defenseless Protestants on their knees in prayer, dismembered others, threw bodies out of windows, and beheaded who they could. Dead bodies clogged the Seine and turned the water red with blood. Soon, the terror spread to the rest of France. Estimates of the final death count vary dramatically, but some say 40,000 victims died during the 2 weeks of uncontrolled violence. Just by way of comparison, Queen Mary, called Bloody Mary, the Catholic English monarch, known for her persecution of the Protestants, burned only 357 Protestants during 7 years of reign. The number of casualties during the 2 weeks in France exceeded even the entire number of deaths that occurred over the 8 years of the American Revolutionary War. So villains emerged that night, but so did heroes. Hubert
Languet
was one of the heroes and one of the 3 men I would like to highlight. He saved many lives at the risk of his own. One of the few men still armed with a sword because of his diplomatic immunity, he scoured the streets, escorting victims to safety. Finally, a gang of Catholics overpowered him. But as a diplomat to a very powerful foreign prince, his life was spared. And so instead of killing him immediately, he was disarmed and thrown in prison. Once imprisoned, he substituted the pen for the sword and wrote letters to his friends throughout Europe, requesting that they provide safe harbor for Parisian refugees. The number of lives he saved mounted. Philip Sidney, the English darling, at age 17, also found himself in Paris on that fateful night. Philip, an Englishman, was in Paris as the first stop on his gentleman's tour of Europe. He left England after witnessing his former fiancée marry his arch rival. So Anne Cecil, the daughter of the powerful William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, broke off her engagement with Philip to marry Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, just a few months prior to Philip's departure. The rivalry between Philip and Edward de Vere that started over the marriage would only worsen with time. The worries over the humiliation of a broken engagement seemed trivial the night of the massacre. Thankfully, an Italian nobleman, at the behest of the Queen Mother, arrived on Philip's doorstep and escorted Philip to safety at the English ambassador's residence. Once there, Philip huddled with other fugitives while the bloody violence raged in the rest of the city. Sir Francis Walsingham attended the wedding and also survived the massacre. He was in Paris serving Queen Elizabeth as the ambassador to France. He acted, if not heroically, at least with strength and conviction. He used the English embassy to harbor fugitives, hoping to keep them in safety until the mob retired. Then, through his vast network of connections, Walsingham managed to secret Philip away from Paris to Frankfurt, a safe haven for like-minded Protestants. The massacre solidified the friendship between all 3 men that I just mentioned for the rest of their lives. It also profoundly shaped their future motivations, values, fears, and desires. Like any traumatic event or unexpected eruption of murderous terror, even those that did not die were permanently scarred. Francis Walsingham devoted the rest of his life to keeping England and the monarchy safe from such violence. He orchestrated a network of Protestant sympathizing spies all over Europe. He actually utilized the book trade, printers, and print houses as one of his primary sources. Walsingham remains a shadowy yet, I think, important character in the unfolding story of Shakespeare's work. Hubert would devote the rest of his life to the Protestant cause. He allegedly wrote the famous Bendici contra Tyrannos, an essay justifying the right to take up arms against an unjust ruler. The arguments he presents anticipate many of the arguments used by the fathers of the American Revolution. As a humanist who admired Cicero, Hubert also mentored young men who demonstrated an aptitude for scholarship and government service. He placed hope in molding the next generation of leaders and princes. Philip developed a keen interest in politics, leadership, and the fundamental nature of mankind. He hated mobs and valued stability in the monarchy. He despised civil war, having witnessed the carnage that results, and sort of personally maintained a complete aversion to hunting wild game, such as deer, which was quite a popular pastime in England. With the help of Walsingham's vast network of printers and booksellers, Philip traveled from Paris first to Frankfurt and then on to Vienna. There, he met
Hubert,
intellectually powerful, sophisticated, and connected to the most well-known Renaissance scholars in Europe, impressed Philip. Philip, with his keen intellect, facility with languages, and motivation for improvement, captured
his,
notice. The two men became instant friends, bonding over their shared experience in Paris and their common intellectual literary interests. They knew each other briefly, beginning that April in 1573, and then separated when Philip left for Italy. When he left, the two men vowed to continue their burgeoning relationship or friendship by exchanging frequent letters. Thus begins a 7-year-long series of Latin letters that express Hubert's wit, wisdom, and perhaps most revealingly, his feelings and attitudes towards Philip and also Philip's replies. These Latin letters remained untranslated, unread, and largely unknown until the mid-19th century, when a first edition of their translation was printed in 1845, well after the Shakespeare idolatry had rooted itself into the belief systems of scholars and the public alike. The letters animate both men, and in my mind, contain the key to the sonnets. So Hubert fulfilled his vow to write frequently far better than Philip did. In total, Hubert writes 96 letters to Philip over the course of 7 years, and they are a complete delight to read. They're the work of a humanist scholar who communicates intimacy, authenticity, expresses poignant emotions, and seriously considers life's larger questions, and sometimes with equal weight, life's petty concerns. Philip only wrote 17 replies. The discrepancy alone demonstrates a power differential in the relationship. But Philip, when he did write back, writes beautiful, insightful, empathic letters that differ from any other letters he composes in his life. Lucky for us, the two men spend far more time apart than together, so we get the pleasure of watching their friendship unfold over time. We hear their voices and the nuances of the relationship in the pages of their letters. The short time they spend together, on just 4 occasions, on the other hand, is silent for us. Hubert writes from his heart, expressing anxieties, vulnerabilities, and affection. Here's an excerpt from his first letter once Philip leaves for Italy. He complains, "From what care and worry, from what fear indeed you would have freed me if, once in a while, you had written to me on your journey. I did not need an effortful missive, just one that would say, 'Today we have arrived here safely,' or something like that." There's something honest, expressive, and even funny about these types of passages that I enjoyed. But you can also tell from the very first letter, Hubert has developed a little bit of an anxious attachment to Philip. Philip writes a conciliatory letter back that seems to speak with a voice quite older than his 19 years of age and an intimacy that belies their short time together. He writes, "Truly I say, it is important for you to know this, for I am well aware how anxiously fearful a thing is love. But I will say this and say it in all truth. I honor and shall always honor you and your godlike virtue. If only I had enough Latin or you enough English, you would see what tragedies I should construct out of that little doubt of yours." In the first set of early letters, Hubert takes on the role of an overly involved, if not actually intrusive, father or mentor. He concerns himself with the books Philip chooses to read, his ability to write in Latin, and his health. He even calls Philip dearest son on several occasions. He writes, "If I found a little poor adolescent who resembled you in manner and spirit, I should certainly adopt him as my son." Later, however, after several months,
his,
feelings blossom into something more than a fatherly affection. He stops calling Philip my dearest son and starts to confess a more robust kind of attachment, even love, writing, "If I wanted to indulge my feelings, I should write to you about nothing but my love for you." I read the letters with delight. I enjoyed the insights they provided, but it wasn't until I came across a particular passage that I really started to pay attention. Hubert writes, "Seeing your likeness at our friend Albandio's recently so moved me that when I came home, I wrote these little verses, which I am sending you, although I have not written that kind of thing since my first adolescence. I'm prepared to pass myself on to you as a laughingstock and say I do not think my little verses are entirely silly. The painting had inspired him to write verses. Could little verses actually mean sonnets? I remembered a particular line in one of the sonnets. So is it not with me as with that muse, stirred by a painted beauty to his verse. The poet, too, had been inspired by a painting to write sonnets to the fair youth. Soon after this, Hubert asked Philip to sit for a portrait and to send it to him. Philip complies, writing, I am delighted that you ask me so insistently for my portrait. As soon as I go back to Venice, I will have it done either by Paolo Veronese or by Tintoretto, who at the moment are easily the first in that art. Tintoretto and Veronese are both students of Titian's. Titian would live another 2 years. So during this exploration, Philip may have seen the Venus and Adonis with the special bonnet hanging in the artist's studio. This particular painting has been recognized as the inspiration for Shakespeare's famous poem, Venus and Adonis. The painting of Philip by Veronese, if it exists, history must have attributed it to a different artist and identified a different subject. Shocking to think history could make such mistakes. I sat about trying to find them, and of the several possibilities, one portrait of an unknown man now hanging in the museum at Oxford, Philip's alma mater, is a possible candidate. Historians attribute this work to a Florentine artist of the same generation. The young adolescent in the painting has the Sidney red hair and the same fragile look ascribed to Philip. Greek motifs dot the background, including a scantily clad Greek statue of a young man with a lyre leaning against his legs. Hubert complains to Philip when he first receives the portrait that it did not capture Philip's likeness well enough, writing, it seems to me rather to represent someone who looks like you than you yourself, and at first I thought it was of your brother. Most of your features are beautifully expressed, but it is far more youthful than it should be. I think you must have looked not unlike this when you were 12 or 13 years old. Here's a close-up. The features do look similar, although one is clearly younger. When I thought of Hubert's initial disappointment, I found Sonnet 53 more understandable. The sonnet is confusing until you can imagine that the poet might have been describing a portrait of the fair youth, even one with an odd Greek naked statue in the background. What is your substance? Whereof are you made, that millions of strange shadows on you tend? Describe Adonis, and the counterfeit is poorly imitated after you, and you in Grecian tires are painted new. The sonnet seems to be expressing a similar disappointment in the portrait of the fair youth. The last line I quote also makes more sense if you see the portrait with the Grecian statue in the background as another rendition of the same man, just naked. So we know from several other sonnets that the fair youth had a portrait painted of him, and that the poet considered the picture an inferior counterfeit. Sonnet 16, with virtuous wish would bear your living flowers, much liker than your painted counterfeit. Sonnet 46 and 47 also talk about the competing visions of the fair youth, one depicted by the portrait and the other inside the poet's mind. Mine eye and heart are at a mortal war. Mine eye, my heart, thy picture sight would bar. After this discovery, I read with more focus and found points of contact between the letters and almost all of the fair youth sonnets. This is one example where it seems as if Philip has planted a seed of an idea. Philip writes, you will have to apply your mind to writing something so that your admirable virtue may also be known by some unusual monument to posterity. Sonnet 55 almost seems like a response. I won't read the whole beautiful sonnet, but it begins, not marble, nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme. Hubert's mental state parallels the depression, loneliness, and despair that we see in the sonnets. He writes, the slenderness of my wit and fortune and the increasing infirmities of age do not allow me to be of much use either in public or in private, even though the will is not lacking. This is why I fear dangers less. when I see that my life is no use to anyone now, while death must free me from the miseries in which I live. In Sonnet 66, the poet writes as his first line, "Tired with all these, for restful death I cry." As I mentioned earlier, 17 of the sonnets, the procreation sonnets, deal with the older poet urging the fair youth to get married and have a child. This is a rather unusual position for any man to take that is not a relation, and in some ways, it is also an unusual argument for a lover to push. It suggests a relationship between the poet and the fair youth has changed and evolved or devolved. The poet now seems less like a passionate lover and more like an avuncular mentor. The same transition occurs with Hubert and Philip, after Philip returns to England and ghosts Hubert for several months at a time. What starts as jibes evolves into more earnest entreaties and continue for the next 3 years. Hubert writes, "If you take a wife, if you beget children like yourself, you will more usefully devote yourself to your country than if you slaughter 1,000 Spaniards or Frenchmen." All of the procreation sonnets sound this drumbeat. Here is a quote that references the fair youth's duty. "The eyes for duteous now converted are, unlooked on diest, unless thou get a son." And again, "Were in all eating shame and thriftless praise, how much more praise deserved thy beauty's use, if thou couldst answer, this fair child of mine shall sum my count and make my old excuse." We also have geographical points of contact that would remain a mystery if we did not have the letters as references. At one point, Hubert and Philip rendezvous along the River Main in Bavaria. Hubert refers to their conversation on several occasions in his letters. He writes, "See that you remember what I said to you at the mouth of the Main, and write to me about that as soon as you can, as you have promised me several times." Although this, I think, has gone unnoticed, Sonnet 64 talks of the River Main and the firm soil wind of the watery main, increasing store with loss and loss with store. I've never heard that the man from Stratford visited Bavaria. Perhaps most poignant and germane to the theory of mind argument is that both Hubert and the poet seem to have suffered some past trauma. Hubert makes only one direct reference to the massacre, but mentions on several occasions how the wars of religion in France have instilled in him a profound sense of loss and despair. He writes, "For the destruction of my country and the calamities that have recently overtaken my friends makes life sadder to me than death." The poet, too, seems to have suffered loss due to religious differences. The poet writes, "How many a holy and obsequious tear hath dear religious love stolen from my eye." Hubert continues, "My mind is exhausted and oppressed by the calamities of my country, which is France. The only thing left to delight me is the memory of our friendship." The poet also derives solace from the friendship with the fair youth. He writes, "But if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end." Finally, a direct reference to Philip's ancestors who originated in France exists in both the letters and the sonnets. Hubert writes, "If only the desire would seize you to see the shards of our unhappy France, or if only there still lived in you your old desire to tread the soil which 500 years ago welcomed your forefathers at their birth." Sonnet 59 reiterates this reference to the fair youth's ancestors. "Oh, that record could with a backward look, even of 500 courses of the sun, show me your image in some antique book." I will finish by telling the last part of the story. Hubert's last letter to Philip ends the record of their relationship 11 months before he dies. He ends with some rather harsh criticisms about Philip's failure to live up to his potential. Hubert admonishes, "To waste the flower of your youth in the trifles and idleness of the court will be very bad for you." He then pressures Philip to leave England and join a military campaign on the continent in the service of the Protestant cause. 11 months later, on October of 1581, Hubert died in Antwerp without ever seeing Philip again. His last words were recorded by a woman who survived the massacre as well. He gave her a chain that Philip's father had bestowed on Hubert and asked her to return it to Philip. She writes that he then said there was no man in the world whom he had loved anyone so much and whose virtue he had more honored than her husband, whose name is Philip, and he would feel himself only too happy if I would promise to ask on his behalf that in the first book which her husband should bring to light, he should say that they had been friends and that he held Monsieur Languet in honor. Her husband, named Philip, was either intentionally or unintentionally mistaken for Philip Sidney. Charlotte's husband was not the love of Hubert's life. Philip Sidney was. Unfortunately, the confusion robbed Philip of knowing Hubert's last words and robbed him of knowing Hubert's encouragement to publish. Philip, sadly, succumbs to the pressure, perhaps independently, but perhaps with Hubert's words echoing in the back of his mind 4 years later, and joins the English troops in the Netherlands, assisting the Protestants in their war against Catholic Spain. Although he gains some glory, he also loses his life as a result of a wound on the battlefield. He was just about to turn 32. So if we apply theory of mind approach to Hubert, the picture that emerges parallels the picture of the poet. His age, occupation, and physical characteristics match. His mood ranges from depression to a hypomanic, feverish love. He ruminates about death and Philip's safety. Whether warranted or not, he expresses a heightened fear of abandonment. He displays grandiosity, but also is self-deprecating, dependent, and sometimes overly dramatic. His strengths are also similar. He's obviously intelligent, quotes Ovid and the classics widely, demonstrates wisdom, eloquence, and rich metaphorical language, and with a high capacity output. What does the theory of mind approach say about Philip from Hubert's letters and Philip's own replies? As expected, the image varies with time and is much more shadowy. From Hubert's early letters, we get the impression that Philip is an almost perfect specimen of nature. Hubert idolizes his virtue, beauty, truth, intelligence, and endless potential, yet at the same time describes Philip as a young man prone to melancholy, who is overly studious and physically frail. The middle letters suggest that Philip is easily stirred to anger, perhaps lazy or slothful, yet still noble. I would argue these characteristics match the fair youth, if not Philip himself. So what are the implications? Where does this leave us? How does this impact the authorship question? I think making a final attribution of the Fair Youth Sonnets to Hubert will be an almost insurmountable task, but such an attribution could also solve a lot of the issues with the authorship debate. If Hubert wrote the sonnets, it confirms that the attribution of the name Shakespeare is rather meaningless and adds yet more ammunition against the man from Stratford. To be clear, however, I'm not proposing that Hubert wrote the plays. I'm suggesting that the author of the plays and the Fair Youth Sonnets in particular are two separate people. The sonnets were not included in the first folio, which presumably contained the complete works of Shakespeare's. This may be significant and could bolster the idea that another author penned the sonnets, or at least some portion of the sonnets. If Hubert wrote the sonnets, then the author of the plays did not have to live until old age, nor does the author have to have been a man. This opens up the stage to many more possible candidates. So who wrote the plays if Hubert only wrote the Fair Youth Sonnets? As you probably know, I have my own pet theory, but I will save the details of this theory for another time. In brief, though, I think Philip wrote the original versions of the plays, and then other authors, primarily his sister, Mary Sidney, perfected them into the version we know today. Philip was the shining star of the English Renaissance and has all of the credentials to have written the plays. I think he would have been seriously considered as the author if he had not died young. His premature death excluded him, if we include the Fair Youth Sonnets, as an integral member of the works because of the voice of the older man. But if we remove this criteria, we can now examine the merits of Philip as a candidate with more consideration. Although Philip died young, just before his 32nd birthday, Mary, his sister, and a poet in her own right, lived until she was almost 60. As other people have noted, the first folio was dedicated to her 2 sons and Philip's 2 nephews. I will just provide this slide as a little teaser so that you can note the swans that adorn both Philip's engraving and Mary's lace collar. There's no reason why the Shakespeare canon could not have been a progression of works that originated with Philip, but then were transformed by Mary and possibly others into what we know as the Shakespeare canon. This is not the simple solution that I was actually hoping for and that probably everyone else would like. But if it were simple, the mystery would have been unlocked decades, if not centuries ago.